study. We're in this last section on the life of Joseph. And in this section that we're talking about today, we're continuing on Joseph's path to the palace. And back in prior chapters, we looked at this, that Joseph was a pilgrim. He understood that. He was a stranger in the land that he was given to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and he understood the nature of his walk. It was that of a pilgrim. We talked about that they were sheep herders. We talked about the pit, the prison, the palace, and the parallels as we looked at that passage in Genesis. And so Joseph, who is a type of Christ, and that's the parallels aspect. There's many types in this about Joseph being a type of Jesus Christ. We'll see that even more next week. And but he is, as we saw in a prior chapter, his brothers threw him in a pit, sold him into the hands of the Midianites / Ishmaelites, and they brought him to Egypt, and that's where we get down. Now, in between that story, on this path to the palace, we saw last week Judah, and we talked about Judah's downfall and that he went down, how he went down. He separated from his brothers, and we talked about the path that God's people need to avoid lest they fall, lest they go down. Separating from the brethren is step number one. We saw hooking up and hanging out with lost friends being step number two. We saw hooking up, not hooping up, I guess, but hooking up and marrying a lost woman is a fatal step in that downfall, failing to raise a godly seed. We looked at that, how God actually killed a couple of Judah's sons. We saw that he breached his promise to Tamar and his responsibility. And then we saw his fall into fornication, his Hippocratic indignation when he found out that Tamar was pregnant. He didn't know that she was pregnant by him, and that double standard. And then we see a scarlet thread of redemption as he confesses and says that Tamar was more righteous than him when she confronted him, and the Spirit got him to take a hard look at himself. So Judah is there because God was going to use the problem with God's people intermarrying with the Canaanites to move the whole nation to Egypt. This is part of God's plan. He used a famine to separate them from the people of the land and take them to Egypt, where they were I'd say a colony, if you will, in Egypt. The Egyptians did not mix with the Hebrews, and through that, God preserved that seed and eventually brought them back into the land. So we're returning back in chapter 9 to the path to the palace, call it part 2. We're going to go from the pit to the prison, as Chris just read it to us in this text. He is brought down to Egypt, and we're going to look at these things today as we go through this chapter 39. We're going to look at the providence of God. How that, we got our leak reappearing here, huh? Haven't seen that since last winter. So we've got the providence of God in taking him down to Egypt. We're going to see how God made him to prosper. We're going to see his promotion, the position that he raised him to, and the power that he had. We're going to see the proposition that Potiphar's wife makes toward Joseph, and how God proves Joseph, and his purity is laid out for all to see. And the progression, because God is going to use this story to progress him one step closer to the palace. Now, when we were studying the pit, I was making the application that, Joseph was a godly young man. He was one who was obedient to his father. He was willing to do whatever the father told him to do. And because of that, he ends up finding himself in the pit, persecuted. And, how we react in times like that really tells a lot about a person. And Joseph, not of his own choosing, but because he was sold into slavery, was brought down to Egypt. In verse 1, it says, Joseph was brought down to Egypt. This was not a choice that Joseph made. Egypt is a type of the world, and when you see going down to Egypt, that's often the case. But in this case, he was not going willingly. He was going in irons and fetters as a prisoner, but he was brought down there. And they brought him down, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him of the hands of the Ishmaelites, which had brought him down thither. So he came down there a prisoner and became a slave, a servant. Of course, a suffering servant is a type of Christ. The Gospel of Mark is often referred to as the gospel of the suffering servant. So Joseph continues his foreshadowing of the Lord Jesus Christ, and he is brought down to Egypt. And he's brought down to Egypt by the providence of God. God knew what he was doing. He certainly does. There are no mistakes to God. We just had our election. We have a president reelected. We have senators and representatives and all these people that are in place or were elected to office. Irregardless of what you may or may not think of that, understand that while people voted, ultimately it was God who made the decision. I said a couple of weeks ago we would get the leadership we deserve, and that is the case. The Bible says that God sets up kings and removes kings, and that the issue and the hope of the United States, or any nation for that being, if you look back at the history of mankind, that righteousness exalts a nation. But the Bible says sin is a reproach to any people. It also tells us that God turns all nations into hell that forget God. As we look at the judgment of God that God has executed on nation after nation after nation, we as a nation should not be surprised, given the fact that this is a nation that has forgotten God, that we would be under the judgment of God. And so we need to pray for our nation. We are to pray for those that are in authority, for kings and all that are in authority, that those that know God would stand up and be counted, and those that don't know God would hopefully come to a saving knowledge of Jesus Christ. And we need to pray for our people, because as we looked before here recently even, the key is, if my people which are called by my name shall humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then will I hear from heaven and will heal their land. And until we meet those conditions, we should have no expectation that God is going to bless our land. He has already told us that He will judge a land that fails to do that. So what we see with God's purposes with Joseph is that he has a purpose for the nation of Israel. And he has nations that are going to be judged. One, the Canaanites, that he already told us earlier in Genesis that Abraham and them were going to go into a land, and he prophesied that they would go into Egypt back in Genesis, earlier chapter of Genesis. And then they would return back into the land as God brought judgment on the people of the land. He says, because the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. So when he takes Israel to, the children of Israel, children of Jacob to Egypt, he will then bring them back with a mighty hand under Moses and bring them back into the land. And so all that God already had put into the works. Sending Joseph down there was just laying the foundation for what we're going to see in the next few chapters. God is sovereign. He had a purpose. When Joseph got thrown in the pit for angering his brothers because he was favored because he was obedient. That persecution of the believer that's pictured there is not unique to Joseph. And if you do right and you suffer for it, understand it comes with the territory. And he was thrown into the pit. But Joseph, I believe, and as we look at his actions, I'm sure he was confused. I'm sure he had time to think about what God was doing. But you see, Joseph is not defeated by the fact he's been thrown in the pit. We just sang the song, Trust and Obey. Trust and obey. When circumstances turn against us, we need to trust God, realizing that God makes no mistake. We should not have a rotten attitude. You know, Chris was telling me he had some coworkers or something that were Christians that were angry with God over the outcome of the election. You know, angry with God over the outcome of the election? I could almost tell you what the outcome of the election was going to be. Okay? Because we know that God's already said that I'm going to turn all nations into hell to forget God. You know? So we are just following the pattern, and it's coming to pass exactly as the Scripture tells us. Why should we be surprised? Much less, why should we blame God? The condition that's laid out for God's people to see God's blessing on the land is, if my people which are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face. Well, the church is anything but that today. Yeah, there may be little pockets and stuff, and there may be some people that have turned to God and prayed, but God's people collectively are nowhere near that today. Now, we have seen that in the past. You know, there was the Great Awakening back in the late 1700s and early 1800s, where the whole nation, because God's people got on their face and prayed and sought God's face and turned from their wicked ways, and God turned His favor toward this nation. Okay? That has happened in history, but you got to meet the conditions. You can't expect God to deliver when we don't meet the conditions. Yeah? So, to be mad at God, you know, shake our fist at Him, you know, hey, He's already told you how it's going to come down. Should be no surprise. But He teaches us things by this. He doesn't forsake Joseph, okay? Joseph is in the pit. By the end of the chapter, he's going to be in a prison with a little interlude, at Potiphar's house. But God didn't forsake Joseph. Verse 2, it says, and the Lord was what? With Joseph. The Lord was with Joseph. Back up here. The Lord was with Joseph. It says, and he was a prosperous man. Verse 3, the master saw that the Lord was what? With him. With him. Verse 21, at the end, he's now in prison. But the Lord was what? With Joseph. And verse 23, the keeper of the prison looked not to anything that was under his hand, because the Lord was what? With him. 4 times. He says the Lord was with him. You see, blessing, he was a prosperous man, is not about where you are. He blessed him as a slave in Potiphar's house. He blessed him after he went to prison. Okay? So, blessing is not about where you are, but about who is what? With you. Okay? That's the issue. We get all caught up in the circumstances. And somehow we seem to equate bad circumstances with a lack of blessing. Nothing could be farther from the truth. Blessing is not circumstance dependent. Teresa's been reading some books, and sharing with me some of the things. She's got, she reads them on her little telephone now. But anyway, she's been reading book after book of Christians and their testimonies and stuff in Romania, in prison, others where they were in bad circumstances. But God was with them in the prisons. We may find ourselves, given the direction things are going, in prison, believers. Don't think that is not a possibility. I believe it's coming. The Lord delays His coming. As you look at some of the decisions that occurred in this election, I'm not just talking about men, but the direction of the country, to where same-sex marriage is legalized in more states, okay? And I guarantee you that hate speech is will come right on the tail of that. And so those that would preach this book will probably be targeted. It's coming. It's coming. So don't be surprised when it comes. All you got to do is look back through history to see that is what happens in nations that forget God. As the power of the state increases. So there's nothing about this that should be shocking. Our prayer ought to be, even so come, Lord Jesus. Punch my ticket, get me out of here, because we know where it's going. As Martha says, circling the drain. Okay? Now, Joseph is, at the beginning of this chapter, has been sold into slavery, okay, to Potiphar, a wealthy Egyptian, and evidently the keeper of the prison, okay. So he has been sold into slavery. And he prospers because the Lord is with him. And he prospers the Egyptian because the Egyptian has bought Joseph and he is a servant in his house. It says, verse 2, the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man, and he was in the house of his master the Egyptian. And his master saw the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all that he did to prosper in his hand. And Joseph found grace in his sight and served him. And he made him overseer over his house and all that he had put into his hand. And it came to pass from the time that he made him overseer in his house and over all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was upon all that he had in the house and in the field. So Joseph, God blessed. God was with Joseph, okay? And Joseph served his master, and no doubt served him diligently. But the blessing for the Egyptian was not just because of Joseph's work. It says very clearly, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house because of Joseph. Okay? So blessing is not based on our work, but God's work. He found grace, that's true, in the eyes of Potiphar. Verse 4, he found grace in his sight, and he served him, and he, Potiphar, made him overseer over his house. He gave him a position as overseer. And he gave him power in that he had everything, all that he had there in verse 5, he's committed unto Joseph's hand. I mean, Potiphar was down to the point all he had to worry about was what was for dinner, okay? Because everything else in his household, all his assets, all his investments or whatever else, whatever he had, was under Joseph's stewardship. And he was promoted to that position. But the psalmist says in Psalm 75, verses 6 and 7, for promotion cometh not from the east, nor from the west, nor from the south, but God is the judge. He putteth down one and setteth up another. Yeah, you know, I had a dad that taught me a work ethic. And I'm thankful for that. And God blessed me in those early years of working, because what he told me to do was do your job and half of your boss's, and you'll end up with your boss's job, you know? And it was amazing. That's exactly what happened. And so I just started doing that, you know? And I worked hard and diligently, and God blessed. But he blessed me disproportionate to my work. He really did. He blessed me disproportionate to my work. I was getting promotion after promotion after promotion. I didn't have a college degree, you know, in those early years. I didn't have enough money to go to school. I'd go to school until my money ran out, and then I'd have to drop out and go back to work, get a little more money. I didn't take out student loans, you know, that most of these kids take out and never pay back now. But that's okay because the government paid for it. I didn't do that. I worked and got a little bit, put in a few hours here and a few hours there. But I was getting blessed disproportionate to my effort. Now, we don't like to think of it that way. We like to think of it, look what I did. But in reality, looking back, and even at the time, it was kind of amazing. Kind of amazing. Because God blesses disproportionate to our effort. I mean, if it's something that we can do, we can go back and say, this is what I did. But with God's blessing is present, it will be disproportionate to your labor, beyond even what you put to it. And he was blessed, this Egyptian was blessed, because the Lord blessed the Egyptian for Joseph's sake. I mean, this Egyptian was the beneficiary, if you will, of God's blessing on Joseph, because he was taking him from the pit to the palace. Now, Joseph didn't, I don't think, understand that at the time. He didn't know that he was going to end up second only to Pharaoh in Egypt. He didn't know exactly why all this was going on, but Joseph trusted the Lord, and the Lord was with him, and he was obedient to his father Jacob, and he was obedient to the Lord. Trust and obey. Obey. Trust and obey. Now, there's a reason. You go through trials. You find yourself in the pit, so to speak. You don't understand why you're in the pit. You think, I've been trying to serve him. I've been trying to do what's right. And then all of a sudden you end up in the pit. You don't know why you're there. You know? And like I said, but if you understand God, if you know God doesn't make mistakes. God doesn't have an eraser on his pencil. All things work together for them that love God, for those are the called according to his purpose. You may not understand it at the time, but you can trust him. You can trust him. Don't do the woe is me stuff. Don't do the why me stuff. God teaches us obedience through suffering. Now, I doubt that any of us would sign up if I say, hey, you know, God wants to teach you something that's going to require some suffering. Just sign up here. You know, that's not the way we operate. But that's the way God operates. Hebrews 5:8 is talking about Jesus. It says, though he were a son, yet he learned obedience by the things which he suffered. Now, Jesus is the Son of God, and he is also God the Son. But Jesus is our example. He learned as fully God and fully man. He learned obedience through the things that he suffered. Philippians 2:8 says, being found in fashion as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient unto death, even the death of the cross. How did he do that? He trusted his Father. This was God's plan. This is why he came to earth. And he did that and only that which God called him to do. He spoke that and only that which God told him to say. As an example to us, we learn obedience through the things we suffer. You know, we really don't learn much when things are going good. Matter of fact, we don't learn squat normally when things are going good. Now, Ecclesiastes in 7th chapter, it says that there's more to be learned in the house of mourning than there is in the house of mirth. That's what he's talking about. When there's money in the bank and the bills are paid, you don't have to trust God. You can trust in your bank account or your 401k or your retirement plan or the government to take care of you. You don't have to trust God. We're in a whole society that doesn't know anything about trusting God. Let me tell you, the legs are being kicked out from under the stool, left and right. Those of us who watched our retirement funds evaporate, equity in your house evaporate, the jobs evaporate, you end up out of work and you're 55 or older. You'll see what the job market is like. All this stuff, the economy going down, the dollar is becoming worthless. He's taken prop after prop after prop. Look at the society today. They don't need God. They got government. Yeah. One of these days the checks are going to quit coming. One of these days the cutbacks are going to come. It is coming. It is coming. And we'll see the rioting in the streets like you see in Greece, Portugal, some of these other places. It's coming. You can only kick the can down the road so long because these things are coming. But we'll learn obedience by the things we suffer. 1 Peter 4:1 says, "For as much then as Christ has suffered for us in the flesh, arm yourselves likewise with the same mind, for he that hath suffered in the flesh hath ceased from sin." We need to understand that suffering, God uses suffering in our life. Verse 12 of the same chapter, he says, "Beloved, think it not strange concerning the fiery trial which is to try you, as though some strange thing has happened unto you." All of a sudden you're suffering. All of a sudden you find yourself in the pit. And you act like, "Oh my God, why is this happening to me?" Comes to the territory. We learn obedience by the things which we suffer. Joseph, he was preparing him for the job that he had for him. He was preparing him to run not only Potiphar's house and not only the prison, but the whole nation of Egypt. He was preparing him. He was on a path to the palace. And the prosperity that Joseph had was not just because Joseph was brilliant or just because Joseph was a hard worker, okay? But it was the blessing of God. God blessed him. And God blessed the Egyptian, okay? And he does it, he blessed him in the role of a servant, in the role of a slave. He wasn't, he was the beneficiary, this Potiphar, of Joseph's blessing. And he recognized it and saw it in his life. There was something different about Joseph. Joseph was a man who was pulled out of a pit, transported as a slave in shackles, sold into slavery, but he was not like the other people, the other slaves. He trusted God. He saw something different in him. And the Lord promoted him. Yeah, Potiphar thought he promoted him, but really it was the Lord that promoted him, because promotion is not just a human thing, especially with God's people. God puts down one and puts up another. He sets up kings and removes kings. The king's heart's in the hand of the Lord. He turns it whithersoever he will. And so he is set up and he is running Potiphar's house. Verse 5 says, "It came to pass from that time that he made him overseer in his house over all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was upon all that he had in the house and in the field." The Lord did that. And he left all that he had in Joseph's hand, and he knew not aught he had, save the bread which he did eat. Like I said, his biggest worry then was what's for dinner, because he had put it all under Joseph's hands. And Joseph was a goodly person and well-favored. He was a goodly person. He was well-favored. He was given the context, I think he was probably a good-looking Hebrew young man, okay? And somebody else noticed in Potiphar's house. Here comes the proposition. And it came to pass, verse 7, after these things, that his master's wife cast her eyes upon Joseph, and she said, Lie with me. But he refused, and said unto his master's wife, Behold, my master wotteth not what is with me in the house, and he hath committed all that he hath to my hand. There is none greater in this house than I. Neither hath he kept back anything from me but thee, because thou art his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? Mrs. Potiphar took notice of Joseph. Evidently he was a good-looking young man, and obviously he was now in charge of all of Potiphar's assets, and she wanted him. But he refused. And there's three things he does here that, we want to overcome temptation, or, that like he had, which had to be incredible. The first thing you do is you refuse. He refused. Kind of like Moses, it says that he refused to be be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather the affliction with the people of God than the pleasures of sin for a season. He refused. She's offering it, okay? He refuses it. And then he refuses her first. Then he reproves her. In the last part of verse 8, he kind of rehearses his duty. He says there, Behold, my master wotteth, which means knoweth not what is with me in the house, and hath committed all that he hath into my hand. There is none greater in this house than I, neither hath he kept back anything from me but thee. How can I do that? He has trusted me with his entire house. And he rehearses this duty and obligation and loyalty to his master. I can't touch you. He's given me everything but you. And then he rebukes her. He calls it what it is. He says, How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? Not just a sin against Potiphar, but it is a sin against God. And so there's the key when you find yourself in that circumstance where immorality is being offered. Mrs. Potiphar is ready to enter into an adulterous relationship. And Joseph says, no. Not going to do it. Not going to do it. He calls it, verse 10. And it came to pass, as she spake unto Joseph day by day, that he hearkened not unto her to lie by her or to be with her. And it came to pass about this time that Joseph went into the house to do his business, and there was none of the men of the house there within. And she caught him by the garment, saying, Lie with me. And he left his garment in her hand and fled and got out. So he refused her advance. He reproves her and saying, My master has given me everything in the house but you. To do that, he rebukes her and said would be a great wickedness against his master and a sin against God. And then when she persists, he flees. The New Testament says, flee fornication. Run from it. The man of God will, even if it's offered, will run from it. Okay? Run from it. Verse 10 says, It came to pass as she spake unto Joseph day by day. Day by day. Understand, women like this don't quit. They don't quit. This just wasn't a single proposition. It was an ongoing situation. Day by day, as she spake to Joseph day by day, that he hearkened not unto her to lie by her or to be with her. Well, you don't have to lie with me. We don't have to go to bed together. Let's just sit on the couch and I need somebody to talk to. They don't quit. They stalk. Lie with or be with. They negotiate. They negotiate. The devil knows how to do it. Proverbs 6:26 says, For by means of a whorish woman, a man is brought to a piece of bread, and the adulteress will hunt for the precious life. The adulteress will look for the one who is the man of God. They'll look for that precious life. And they will hunt them and stalk them day by day. And by the way, men do the same thing. Kind of wear them down. I'm not just going after the ladies. You can make the application both ways. But you see how it works? They make the approach. If that's rejected, they don't go away. They just try to wear you down, so to speak, or negotiate. You know, my husband's away on business all the time. I just need somebody to talk to. You know, I am so lonely. Can't you just stay and talk with me a while? Spending time with a woman who is not your wife alone is playing with fire. Playing with fire. He's propositioned. He refuses her. His purity comes out. Verse 11. It says, And it came to pass about that time that Joseph went, back verse 13 says, It came to pass when she saw that he had left his garment in her hand. She grabs a hold of his cloak. He just runs right out of his coat. Okay? Had left his garment in her hand and fled forth, that she called unto the men of her house and spake unto them, saying, See, he hath brought in a Hebrew to us to mock us. He came into me to lie with me. I cried with a loud voice. You know, it came to pass when he heard that I lifted up my voice and cried, that he left his garment with me and fled and got him out. And she laid up his garment by her until her Lord, that's Potiphar, came home. And she spake unto him according to these words, saying, the Hebrew servant which thou hast brought unto us came unto me to mock me. And it came to pass, I lifted up my voice and cried, and he left his garment with me and fled out. And it came to pass, when his master heard the words of his wife, which he spake unto him, saying, after this manner did the servant to me, that his wrath was kindled. And Joseph's master took him, put him in the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were bound, and he was there in the prison. So he was falsely accused. He was proven in that he had every opportunity, if he wanted to do this, to do it. Okay? It was offered to him. There was no one in the house to see it. And he rejected it. And, you know, the old saying is, there is no wrath like a woman's scorn. He rejected her. He rejected her. He said, no, I'm not going to do it. And literally fled. There's a cost. He made a choice. I'm sure he knew that that was going to cost him. And sure enough, she makes the false accusation. But he overcame the temptation. Like I said, his character, his integrity, his honesty, you know, he took a stand. He took a stand. He made the right choice. He was going to lose his position. He was going to lose his power and authority in Potiphar's house, and he ends up in prison as a result of it. Again, for doing what's right, what was moral, that which pleased God, cost him. And he ends up, this time not in the pit, but in prison. In prison. That, his character and integrity were vindicated. But it cost him. You know, some would jump at the proposition. Some would look around and say, is anybody going to see? Will anybody know? You see, your integrity is the issue is when nobody's around and nobody's going to see. That's the issue of your integrity. That's how your purity is shown. And so he ends up in prison for doing what was right, for rejecting the wickedness and the sin against God. It cost him. And doing right will cost you. And as I say, given where we are as a society and we are as a country, I think that test is looming. That test is looming. Are you going to do that which keeps you in position and keeps you in power or keeps you employed? Or are you going to compromise because you might lose your position, you might lose your power, and the price of keeping your position and keeping your power is to compromise? Joseph did not compromise. He trusted God. He learned obedience by the things that he suffered. Because he already by now had learned and will continue to learn that prospering is not measured the way a man measures it. You know, the blessing of God is not based on your circumstance. He had the blessing of God when he was in the pit. He had the blessing of God when he was in chains. He had the blessing of God when he was a slave in the house of Potiphar. And he had the blessing of God when he finds himself in prison. Verse 21. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. You know? Like I said, when the Bible repeats something, I've told you this before, and I think most of you know it. You see it once, all right, it's there once. You see it repeated, you need to perk up your ears a little bit. When you see in one chapter that phrase 4 times, the Lord was with him, the Lord was with him, the Lord was with him, the Lord was with him. The Lord blessed the Egyptian because of him. You know? The blessing of God is not conditioned on our circumstance. It isn't about where we're at. It's about who's with us. When we were studying the Gospel of Luke, and you talked about I talked to him, preached about the Sea of Galilee, you know, and at that time we had some leave, and they were saying, you know, like, get off the boat. Well, when you look at the boat in the Sea of Galilee, it isn't about getting off the boat. It's about who's in the boat. You know, when the storms were tossing the boat and they were fearing for their life, where was Jesus? Asleep in the back of the boat. Okay? All they had to do was settle down, go back there. Master, carest not that we perish? Peace be still. Who's in the boat with you? Doesn't matter where you're at. Doesn't matter where you're at. You can be in a pit. You can be in the prison. You can be in Potiphar's house. You know, I'm sure Potiphar's house was nice. You know, one day you can be in a really nice top of the game, and the next day you can be in the prison. It's all about, is he with you or not? Is he with you or not? And so there's no mention here of him giving a rebuttal to this accusation. Now, maybe he did, maybe he didn't. He was falsely accused. I tend to believe he was like Jesus. He didn't answer back. In front of his accusers, he was just silent. Didn't incriminate the guy's wife. He just, Potiphar's upset. Potiphar throws him in prison. He finds himself in prison, but the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. Just change locations, and now he's going to run the prison. Okay? So he endures the wrath or the scorn of the woman. He apparently is silent. At least there's nothing recorded here that he cast accusations back. He endured the wrong, and he ends up just one step closer to the palace. And he's promoted again. Again. Like I said, the blessing of God It's not dependent on all those things. And it's not even dependent on our own works. Now, like I said, I believe that Joseph was a diligent young man. I believe, from what I can see here, he took the stewardship of Potiphar's house. He took the stewardship of the prison, and no doubt did what the Bible tells us to do. Do all to the glory of God. Whatever God has given you to do, you do all to the glory of God. But the blessing was not just because of Joseph's work, but because of God's blessing. It was because of God's mercy. God gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. The promotion came from God. That's the key with the blessings of God. You see, old Jacob, remember him? Back in Genesis 32:26, he's wrestling with the Lord. He said, "Let me go, for the day breaketh." And he said, "I will not let thee go, except thou bless me." After Jacob was totally incapacitated, all he could do was cling to the Lord. And the Lord says, "Let me go." And he says, "I will not let thee go until thou bless me." Jacob had to learn that lesson. Joseph learned that lesson. You can work your tail off, but the end result, it's the blessing of God. And it doesn't matter whether you're in the pit or in Potiphar's house or in prison. The issue is God with you? And what did he tell us in the New Testament? It says in the book of Hebrews, he says, "I will never leave you nor forsake you." No excuse for the believer to shake his fist at God and play the why me and woe is me thing. No excuse whatsoever. God's blessing is indispensable. If you go back and read some of the works and autobiographies of some of the great men of God, they understood that. They understood that the blessing or the anointing of God on their life and ministry was not dependent upon them. It was God being with them. And I don't care which one you go back to. You can go back to Jonathan Edwards or Robert Murray McShane, the great old Scottish Presbyterian preacher, or you can go to George Whitefield, or you can go to the Wesleys or Spurgeon or Billy Sunday or D.L. Moody or R.A. Torrey or any of them. And somewhere in those autobiographies, you will find statements that basically say the same thing. That the blessing of God, the anointing of God, is what we need. It's what we need in this nation. If we want to see a revival in this nation, it's God that's got to bring it. We have to meet the conditions, but it's God that has to bring it. And when He does, sometimes the result of it is far more than you can ever anticipate. Like I said, when you study the Great Awakening or the Second Great Awakening, those movements of God, there was no doubt that it was not a human effort. I remember, I think it was R.A. Torrey in his that I read, and that at least came to mind. He said, when God's anointing descended, I can't remember exactly how he said it. He says, I wasn't any better preacher than I was before. He says, my preaching wasn't any better than it was before. But he said the result that came from the preaching was unexplainable. Unexplainable. Because God was with him. And God blessed him. God moved in their midst. And And old Joseph here is on this path from being the favored son of his father. He finds himself in a pit. And then from there, he's going to be sold into slavery and chains and fetters. And from there, he's going to end up in prison. And after that will be the palace. God makes no mistakes. Don't get disheartened. Don't shake your fist at God. Don't say, why is me, woe is me, what's going on? Just trust Him.